I'm not putting any narrows that Disneyland music because the last time I live stream and put music, some of the Narrowland, the last time I live stream and used Narrowland's from Disneyland music, it got copyrighted for a reason, and I'm pretty sure the reason why I got copyrighted is because of the music. I used the video, so yeah, I'm not gonna use that again. So anyways, a huge fight will begin, and yes, I'm making sure that 3 will release this month.
He speaks about his experience in school and
I'll
potentially
try
going to college as his parents
anything
requested
for
him to do so,
30
saying,
to
"School was
release
suffering. I
this
assume college is the
month.
same. Except now you're paying for it. I don't want to go. If I go and hate it, I'll do something bad. Then I'd be in jail or dead. I promise to get more than 2." While this not so subtle remark may seem like the kind of thing a 4chan user would say without putting much stock behind it, Schweibe supposedly sent this same friend quotes and excerpts from Elliot Rodgers' manifesto, saying how much he identified with him and how much they had in common. For the unaware, Elliot Rodger was a 22-year-old man living in Isla Vista, California. After publishing a manifesto outlining his views on the world, struggles with women, and general dissatisfaction, he went on a violent rampage where he took the lives of 6 people and injured 14 others. He has since become somewhat of a meme icon in image board culture. It was clear that this obsession was deep-rooted, and Schweibe had already spent years feeling that way. Though it's very difficult to confirm their legitimacy beyond the shadow of a doubt, someone claiming to be a friend of Schweibe's shared a series of messages exchanged in 2018 wherein he retells a dream he had 2 years prior. This dream, which Schweibe himself calls his wildest fantasy coming true, consisted of a prolonged, detailed narrative about himself miraculously finding weapons in the bathroom during a break period and proceeding to use them on everyone in his school. Despite the story beginning with him gazing at his own physical flaws in the mirror, it doesn't seem to be very relevant to his final decision. Instead, it seems much more likely that the reason behind this fantasy is directly linked to the expectations that people, particularly his family, had about his academic performance, as he cathartically mentions that he has the worst grade compared to everyone he harms in his fantasy, concluding the story with, "I'll never be as intelligent as them, but I know for the rest of my probably short-lived life that you don't need to be intelligent to be satisfied with a job well done. The pleasure I felt doing that can't be described in words." Regardless of how cringeworthy some parts, if not all, of this fantasy may be, the main thing to take away is that this was a genuine desire of his that he, at the time, took seriously. Whereas he felt powerless when it came to being a good student that would seamlessly transition from high school to college, his mind went to this scenario as the solution to it, and his attachment to the feeling of power he imagined this would give him made it so that even his closest friends had a hard time dissuading him from it. Eventually, and luckily, his plan was foiled, though it's unsure what exactly this means other than him saying that he was caught. Certainly it had something to do with his parents, as according to him, neither of them trusted him anymore. However, just because he had given up on hurting other people did not mean Schweibe had gotten better. In a conversation he was having on Discord, a friend of his said, "Every year, we have a house dinner. The entire dorm has this fancy-ish dinner. I hate this so much. If I went ahead with what I'm planning to do, I wouldn't have to go through that. Why am I such a coward?" In reply, for once, Schweibe played the role of a reasonable counterpart, saying, "It's because you know, deep down, that's not the answer to your problems. I know this too, yet I still want it. We're not meant to be happy, but maybe we can manage with just being neutral." Unfortunately, his sentiment didn't stand up to scrutiny for very long. After exchanging his last few text messages with his friends, he decided to start a call with them, and when a couple joined, he asked them to start recording and whether or not they could hear him. His friends complied, though at least one of them was profusely crying and asking Schweibe to not do what he was planning to do. Due to his nonchalant attitude and even occasional laughs, one of his friends thought it was a troll. Tragically, it wasn't, and their requests for him to reconsider it were to no avail. Schweibe had with him a sign that said "Goodbye R9K" in reference to the 4chan board he frequented most. This sign also had the date of March 14th, 2018. Another note he had said goodbye to his mom and asked her not to let the kids see any of it. Besides the recording, he also started a live stream on his YouTube channel simply titled Friends complied, though at least one of them was profusely crying and asking Schweibe to not do what he was planning to do. Due to his nonchalant attitude and even occasional laughs, one of his friends thought it was a troll. Tragically, it wasn't, and their requests for him to reconsider it were to no avail. Schweibe had with him a sign that said "Goodbye R9K" in reference to the 4chan board he frequented most. This sign also had the date of March 14th, 2018. Another note he had said goodbye to his mom and asked her not to let the kids see any of it. Besides the recording, he also started a live stream on his YouTube channel simply titled "Hey." He was wearing a mask and a beanie, and behind him, he had hung up a blue tarp, presumably to prevent the spread of debris. About 6 minutes into the recording, Schweibe showed that despite having lost the trust of his parents, he hadn't lost access to what he needed in order to do what his friends feared he ultimately would. The blast knocked over the tarp and the camera, and the recording went on, and his friends expressed their despair over what had just happened. A little later, it became exponentially worse as his mom walked into the room and immediately began crying, only to lift up the tarp and scream in horror. Given that his untimely passing was broadcasted directly to those on the 4chan boards he frequented, it was picked up as a topic almost immediately. While most grieved and lamented the facts that a young person like Shuaib ended the way he did, a rumor was quickly spread about him regarding another situation that I already covered on my main channel and interviewed the main quote-unquote organizer of on my second channel. The post in question basically claims that what Shuaib did was in some way related to him being dissatisfied with the results of HRT. People speculated he'd done it due to the pressure of being blackmailed by R9K's femboy cult. Neither of these things are true, nor were many of the other rumors that popped up, such as him having done this because of a breakup, or that R9K had driven him to this in some other way. In reality, he just had poor mental health. All of this was eventually revealed by one of Shuaib's friends, who made a thread on R9K and posted an unforeseen image of him to prove his authenticity. One of the consequences of what had happened was that R9K moderators banned Discord threads. The news of Shuaib's passing was covered in a few other outlets, but to this day, not much is known about what exactly led him to his final decision. A memorial page was put up by his family to mourn him, and to this day, his story stands as a grim reminder of how disaffected even the most seemingly common people can be as a consequence of mental health issues. Steve Steffens was a 37-year-old African-American man who lived in Cleveland, Ohio. Being the nephew of a local reverend, Steve lived most of his life as a regular, well-behaved citizen. Besides a dozen or so traffic tickets from the late 90s and early 2000s, Steve had no criminal record to speak of. As a child, he lived with his sister, brother, and mother on East 85th Street, and according to his neighbors, there were no signs of dysfunction coming from his family. Steve himself, whose nickname in the neighborhood was Smokey, was described as someone who never even got angry, let alone be aggressive towards someone else. As a teenager, he mostly kept to himself, though people began to notice certain unusual mannerisms from him. One of the things he was known to do was walk around the street with his pet python around his neck, and though it's unsure why exactly he did this, some recall it was a party trick to attract women. One specific neighbor of his was allegedly approached by Steve multiple times, with him telling her that he always had a crush on her and that he wanted her to be his queen, but to no avail, as she described him as unattractive despite his nice personality. Usually, after leaving his mother's house, Steve was seen stopping by neighborhood kids, only to tell them to stay out of trouble, go to school, and not be knuckleheads. At least that's what most people knew him to be like. While the majority of his acquaintances thought him to be awkward but ultimately harmless, a small minority got a glance at Steve's darker side, which also happened to revolve around the pets he kept. One neighbor said this about Steve in his teen years: "That kid was not normal from the beginning. He was in his early teens when the family moved in, and I was in my late 20s, but I could see something wasn't right. He was smart, but some days he seemed okay with talking to people on the street, and then other days he was staring off into space with a blank face. He was very up and down. He asked me to come in and see his pet bird, so I went to their house. He had a parakeet, and he had that bird crawl from the cage and onto his finger. Then he slapped the bird as hard as he could with his other hand, and the bird was lying on the floor. The bird looked dead to me. I looked at him, and he was smiling and laughing as he looked at me and that bird. Hey, animals don't make you weird like that. He was that way before he got that bird. Heard he used to torture other pets he had. He was like that from the time I first met him." Besides what his neighbors remember, very little is known about Steve's early life. As a young adult, he graduated from Myers College, a business school that shut down not long after Steve graduated from it in 2002. During his time there, he was a member of the Omega Psi Phi fraternity, and though he didn't stay in touch with his fellow fraternity members after graduation, he was remembered fondly by them as someone who was always laughing and making other people laugh, even if he was a tad awkward. While it's unknown what Steve did immediately after graduating, he eventually found steady employment as a case manager at Beach Brook, a behavioral health agency in the vicinity of Cleveland. In 2008, he joined an agency to be a youth mentor for teenagers, and eventually became a vocational specialist for the Assertive Community Treatment Team, which targeted older teens and young adults. As far as jobs go, while this probably wasn't the most profitable career he could have gone for, it was one where he could realistically do a lot of good for his community. A few years went by wherein little worth noting took place, and then we get to 2014, when Steve began dating a woman named Joy Lane. Joy, who also went by the last name Carr, also worked at Beach Brook as a case manager and therapist. Presumably that's how the two met and began talking. While Steve only only had his Myers College diploma, Joy had many academic achievements, including a Bachelor of Arts degree in Sociology and Criminal Justice, as well as a Master of Science degree in Social Administration. In 2014, in conjunction with her work at Beechbrook, Joy became a part of the adjunct faculty at Cleveland State University. Later on, in 2016, she got yet another job as clinical supervisor at Murtis Taylor Human Services System. On top of all that, Joy was also a veteran that had previously served in the United States Air Force. Joy's continuous development possibly was one of the things that aggravated Steve, who by contrast grew increasingly stagnant and dysfunctional in his personal life. While Joy was seeking growth in her career, unbeknownst to most people, Steve was trying to take a shortcut to financial success via gambling. This meant that most, if not all, of the money he made from Beechbrook, which wasn't that much in the first place and came just a couple thousand shy of $30,000 annually, was being streamlined into paying his gambling debts to the neglect of every other bill he was supposed to pay. As early as 2012, Steve was being sued for unpaid credit card debt, and his wages began being garnished. So he had even less available income to work with. 3 years later, Steve filed for bankruptcy, declaring over $35,000 worth of debt. $21,000 of it came from an unpaid loan he took out to purchase his Dodge Charger. A little over $5,000 were student loans, and the rest was split between credit card debt and payday loans he never paid back. On top of all of that, he only had $350 to his name. Just a few months after he was discharged for bankruptcy, Steve started a YouTube channel called Triple Jointed TV. Many of the videos in it feature him fishing, with some odd uploads wherein he gave bowling tutorials or celebrated the victory of the Cleveland Cavaliers. Whether he made the YouTube channel in the hopes of monetizing it to pay off his debt, or just to have some fun is unknown, but it quickly went inactive. Also in 2016, he created a Twitter account by the handle of StevieSteve45, which eerily foreshadowed the later events in his life. Another year went by and it was clear that the bankruptcy did nothing to curtail his addiction to gambling as he continued to rack up debt. In one of his videos from 2016, Steve mentions being at the casino, meaning he was definitely gambling again. A little later on in the same year, he was evicted from his apartment due to his failure to pay rent, only for the eviction claim to be dropped in favor of further garnishing Steve's debt to the tune of $1,800 to cover what he owed. 5 months later, he got evicted once more from another apartment, though nothing indicates any of these punitive consequences prevented him from continuing to gamble away every single penny he had left. Over the course of their relationship,
Just gonna go
Steve
shoot
behaved
a
very
single
well towards
frame
Joy and their children,
that's about
despite
to
the
fight
obvious
Super
downward
16.
spiral he found himself falling into with his addiction to gambling. She remembered him as loving and caring, but beneath the
There,
surface,
now
his
it's
mental
not
health
blurry.
issues were reaching a boiling point. It all came to a head on April 14th, 2017, when, after a period wherein the couple slowly distanced themselves from one another, as Joy took issue with Steve's gambling debt, which was becoming impossible to conceal as he was being evicted from his apartment,
Now let
the
me...
two broke up.
Okay, let's end the live stream right now.
Steve